there's a lot of speculation on what's going on when it comes to Doom the Dark Ages sales numbers, because it's very clear to see that the game underperformed. It's not doing as well as Eternal. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody plays it. The most noticeable thing about this game is that DSP is not a big fan of it, but that's Dark Side Phil. Okay, like if anything, to me, it kind of felt like fanboys were kind of weaponizing Phil to kind of distract people from the fact that nobody's really all that thrilled about the Dark Ages. And there's a whole lot of reasons for this. I've talked about the decline of the Doom games. I've talked about how disappointing Doom Eternal was. I've talked about how people get bored of games by the third entry. Like there's all these reasons why Doom the Dark Ages kind of unperformed, but I think the major one, the one that nobody is talking about, is that we have a new console coming out in the next couple of weeks. People aren't looking forward to Doom the Dark Ages. People are looking forward to the Nintendo Switch 2 and Mario Kart World. Like they're not interested in like another stale rehash of Doom. We've gotten three of these games in the past decade. The last Mario Kart game we got was in 2014, unless you count the Wii U, the Switch re-release. Like it's been over a decade since the last Mario Kart game. So of course World is more hotly anticipated. Of course it's going to do better. Of course this is going to be a way bigger and better game that like far outperforms everything that like Doom has will ever hope to accomplish. Like again, we kind of saw this with Doom Eternal, right? It launched the same day as Animal Crossing. Animal Crossing completely destroyed it. It's not something that people talk about, or if they do, they kind of downplay it. But the reality is, these hardcore mature games for mature gamers are not as big as the major Nintendo IPs. And what that means is that this is now a thing where Nintendo games will completely take sales away from the AAA slop. Nintendo is stomping the competition, and considering just the release schedule of games this year, like we are starting to see that Nintendo games are just cutting into sales from like other lesser developers and other lesser franchises. So something like Doom, which is a rehash, mediocre 90s IP, basically the Sonic the Hedgehog of first person shooters, right? It's slow, it's old, it's tired. It was never what it was cracked up to be to begin with. It was outdone by like Nintendo games that came out in the 80s. Okay. Doom was never special. It was never interesting. It was never innovative. The only thing keeping it propped up was like just soy jacking game journals who thought it was the greatest game they've ever seen because like, ooh, those evil Christians don't like it. That's basically what Doom is. It is the D&D of first person shooters. It doesn't have any real credibility on its own merits. People don't like the game. People don't play the game. People aren't engrossed in the culture or like care anything about it. Like the important thing about Doom is what it represents. Like this era of like rejecting that evil Christianity and embracing evil and just shooting things and like seeing blood go everywhere and being hyper violent and like, oh, this isn't a game for kids. It's that mindset is just a relic of the 90s, and it really has died down over the past couple of decades because now people can see pretty clearly that games like Mario Kart World inherently have more value than something like Doom. Mario Kart World will stay relevant forever. It'll be an iconic racing game. It's going to have online play. It's going to be endlessly replayable. You'll be able to play it like, you know, in all sorts of different conditions with all sorts of different people. Like with Doom: The Dark Ages, you'll probably play through the game once and never touch it again. Like don't tell me like Doom's gonna have like uh, that multiplayer matters because it doesn't. Like never tell me that like this is the greatest FPS FPS campaign ever because it isn't. Don't tell me it's better than Eternal because first of all, like Eternal was trash and wasn't as good as 2016 to begin with. But like under what metric is Doom the Dark Ages an exciting release? Because to me, you know, this is a game that's coming out right before a new piece of hardware drops, like, and I have no interest in even like really seeing what the game is like, honestly. Like, they really should have made this a Switch 2 launch title. The fact that they didn't was a major oversight on the part of the developers, and I think has really cut in on the game's performance and its long-term relevancy. Like, I think this game doing as badly as it has is going to usher in like a new dark age for the IP. Like, people are going to make excuses about it. They're going to try and deny reality, but the the issue with Doom: The Dark Ages is that this was not a game that was on par with what Nintendo was doing. Nintendo's release completely overshadowed this slop. And I think that is going to be like a reoccurring theme throughout the rest of the year is that these big major AAA Nintendo games are easily going to outperform what Sony, Sony and Microsoft are doing, right? That is the end all be all of this is that like there is no like there is no getting away from Nintendo's market dominance. You know, this used to, the cope used to be that like, well, at least we produce mature games for mature gamers, but like now you don't even have that anymore. You know, now Nintendo has been stopping you in that regard for a decade now. And you know, the rest of the culture is catching up to you in that regard. You know, and Doom fanboys are in denial about this, like PC fanboys are in denial about this, but like there simply is no stopping like Nintendo's market dominance going forward. You are not going to be able to downplay major Nintendo franchises the way you did in the 2000s, right? You're not going to write off like games like Wind Waker or Luigi's Mansion or Mario Sunshine. You know, I remember that happening. You know, like it just isn't going to be possible because people are going to buy those games. They're going to play those games and they're going to ignore the alternatives. You know, the games on other platforms that have no reason to exist. You know, Doom is just another example of some mediocre Western IP that was propped up to try and compete against Nintendo. Right. It's no different than Ultima. It's no different than like Baldur's Gate 3. It's no different than like every other like piece of slop we've had like shoveled into our plates over the past like 25 years. Okay. Like it's just another example of how the AAA industry cannot compete with Nintendo. Nintendo has defeated them so completely and so utterly that no developer can possibly compete.